Good morning. Hey, good morning and good afternoon for those that are joining on both sides of the Atlantic and globally. On behalf of the German Marshall Fund in the United States, we want to welcome you to today's virtual event, which is going to be focused on Russia in the midst of the coronavirus, but also really a focus on Vladimir Putin and how the coronavirus has really changed dynamics internally in Russia in a way that many those that follow what's taking place in the Kremlin with Russia could not have imagined 3 to 4 months ago that this would be the Russia that we're seeing today. For those of you who don't know, my name is Jonathan Katz. I'm a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund in Washington, D.C. I also direct GMF's Frontlines of Democracy Initiative. And I'm really pleased that I can co-host today's event with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, who are partnering with us today. GMF has a history of both working with RFERL. We're proud of that. But we also have a long history of working in Russia and on Russia and in the spaces surrounding Russia as well in Europe, Eurasia. So it's really an honor to be here today with these frontline journalists. Last Sunday, we all recognize World Press Freedom Day, which took place last Sunday, and I think it's really important just to recognize not only your work but those that are on the front lines reporting. I guess I really feel, and I'm sure many of you would agree, that the environment globally has never been the way that it is in terms of transparency, need for transparency, for information, but also the threat to journalists on the front line. So I'm happy that we could actually have this event this week because I think it connects directly to that challenge. Before we dive in, I just want to go over a few housekeeping rules. Everybody's been on virtual events, but just in case you have not, just for this event, it's an on-the-record event. It's actually being live streamed right now. So you can also refer back to it if you want later, if you're interested. But during the event, you're only going to see the speakers. They can't see you. Everyone is on mute except for the speakers. But we will have a Q&A session coming up after our opening statements of our panelists. And if you aren't aware, there's a Q&A button at the top of your Zoom screen. Please send them in. You can do it throughout the entire event. If there's something that's already on your mind, please send it in. So we welcome your questions. What I want to do now is just sort of jump into our and turn to our speakers first. But I just want to highlight who we have joining us from RFERL. We have Steve Gutterman, who is the editor of the Russia desk and author of The Week in Russia. In fact, I think it just actually this Week in Russia just came out, or at least it just came across my screen as we were talking. And it's actually been one of the real go-to reads, both in Washington and Europe, in terms of better understanding what's taking place in Russia. And so, Steve, it's really a pleasure to have you here speaking with us today. We also have Irina Lagunina, who's Russian Service Special Projects Director at Radio Free Europe, RL. Irina, thank you for being here. And I know that there's a lot that you want to comment on, but also you have such a long history and your background in terms of being in journalism and also your insights in terms of what's taking place are going to be greatly appreciated for this conversation. Kiryl, I didn't mean to leave you last. All three of you in your own rights are just extraordinary experts in journalists. And you are also the executive director for news for Current Time. And this is a difficult time for you and your colleagues too, as you're producing material, making certain that you're getting accurate information quickly. And one thing I've learned from all in my discussions with RFEs is how the number of those that are actually turning to RFE Current Time for information, how that's increased. And I think that's part of the conversation today is how we are in a different space today than we were 3 to 4 months ago. And so I really want to turn it over to, I'm going to turn it over to Steve first, but in sort of picking up this conversation, this conversation is focused on a new time in Russia with Mr. Putin. And May 9th was supposed to be a significant celebration, highlighting obviously it's Victory Day. It's an historic event, but one of which Russian leaders have used previously to highlight their own leadership, their own power, projecting not only internally but externally to the world. This year, there's going to be, there will be no world leaders traveling to Moscow. The last couple of weeks, the visuals of Mr. Putin have been from his villa versus, doing the things that he thinks highlight his leadership. You look at polling numbers dropping for President Putin. You look at a Russian economy in duress, numbers of COVID-19 cases increasing. If you look back in the beginning of March, there were no cases. The government was clearly at that time trying to downplay the impact of the pandemic. And I do want to say in the middle of this, I mean, our heart and our sympathy goes to the Russians that have been killed, those that are in hospitals, frontline workers as well. I mean, no different than the frontline workers sitting in New York City or in Brussels. So, really our thoughts are with them. But what this pandemic has exposed is the issue of good governance, bad governance, transparency. And when I think about all the things that you and your colleagues have been writing about, reporting on, it touches on this question of whether a KGB operative is the right person to have in power when you have a need for a manager. You need good healthcare systems, transparency. And in Russia, you're seeing the role of the mayor of Moscow, regional governors, and others playing this front line role where you see Putin sort of fading a little bit more into the background. Things are different. Things have changed. And so, Steve, I'm going to just turn it over to you. I mean, in some sense, it suggests to me that the economic and political crisis, this might be maybe Putin's most difficult crisis, the biggest crisis of his regime. And no one's predicting, what happens next, but it's certainly something that everybody is watching closely, not only from the Russian public, because they're the ones that are impacted by governance or good governance or not. They're impacted by the lack of transparent media or understanding what's happening or having the right type of approach economically to address this challenge. So I'm putting a lot on all three of you today to help us walk us through really what, again, I go back to, we didn't know 3-4 months ago that Russia would be facing these challenges, nor the globe. And there's both the internal things that are happening, but also the impact on Russia's external focus today. And we will touch, and I will ask you too, about a very special and really disturbing story about potential assassination, poisoning attempts in the Czech Republic, in Prague, specific to, reported specifically to Russia, as well as a reminder that even within the context of Russia internally being challenged, that there is a Russia acting externally as well, impacted by the current situation, but also trying to maintain its position vis-a-vis other global powers. So, Steve, I want to turn the floor over to you. And I just want to say that and for all of you, I'm an avid reader of what you guys are watching, what you're writing about, what you're producing, both in written form, on an audio and video form. And so, Steve, it's really an honor to have you here. And I'm hoping you can pick up from where I left off. So over to you.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Jonathan. It's an honor to be here. Thanks very much for your recognition of the three of us, and especially for the RFERL reporters, journalists on the front lines, in bureaus in Russia and elsewhere, who, as you say, are in a particularly dangerous situation for reasons additional to those that they're often in danger. So thanks very much for that. I guess I'd start I want to start by going referring to actually a column that I read this week. I think it was a Bloomberg opinion column. It said basically, the columnist said that the situation, or Putin's self-isolation, I believe hasn't been actually seen out in public for several weeks. That his self-isolation, and I guess his response to the coronavirus, has kind of echoes of Gorbachev's Crimean dacha stay in 1991. That was very striking to me because that's a reference to the fact that Mikhail Gorbachev, the last Soviet leader, was essentially taken captive when there was a hardline coup in Moscow in August 1991. He was taken captive and not allowed to leave this dacha where he'd been vacationing in Crimea. Then the coup collapsed in 3 days, and he returned. Gorbachev, was freed and returned to Moscow, but he never really regained his authority, and he was eclipsed by Boris Yeltsin, the Russian president. And then 4 months later, Gorbachev resigned, and the Soviet Union ceased to exist. So, there are obviously huge differences between the situation with Putin. I mean, nobody's saying he's being held being held captive. Nobody's saying he's about to resign in 4 months. But I think what I got from that comparison was, the question: has something kind of fundamentally changed for Putin, for Russia, essentially due to the coronavirus? And I think, there are various people are saying, Oleg Kashin, who's a kind of a acerbic columnist in Russia, he had a blog recently saying the relationship between the authorities and society, you could read that as Putin and the people, will never be the same again, essentially because of the response or non-response or to COVID-19. So to sort of, and you mentioned Victory Day, the fact that there won't be a military parade, and that Russian leaders, Soviet leaders have used the parade to kind of showcase their power at home and abroad. Putin has done that perhaps more than any. He revived, or the practice of having military weapons, missiles in the parade was revived in 2008, a couple days after he had ceded the Kremlin to Medvedev. But so I just want to kind of go back, take a look at how we got here to the situation where someone might be comparing Putin's situation now to Gorbachev's in 1991. And I think you'd go back to 2012 when Putin returned to the Kremlin after taking 4 years as prime minister in order to avoid violating term limits in the Constitution. Now, since he returned to the Kremlin, there's been a lot of talk over the years about what he would do when he next comes up against term limits in 2024. Now, to me, it seemed for years that the one thing he might not do, or he'd try not to do, was to change the Constitution in order to allow him to be president past 2024. But as it turned out, he is in the process of doing that. He announced proposed constitutional changes in January, and then in March, I think it was March 10th, there was a Duma meeting, and one of the deputies, Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space, proposed that the Constitution additionally be changed to essentially allow Putin to run for 2 more terms, starting in 2024. And then Putin, it was kind of a choreographed, supposedly sudden but choreographed move where he went to the Duma and gave his consent to this proposed amendment, as long as the Constitutional Court agreed to it, said it wasn't unconstitutional. So the court, of course, did that. And then what was supposed to happen in the Kremlin's eyes was April 22nd, a nationwide vote to kind of seal the deal on these amendments. And of course, some would say it wouldn't really lend them popular legitimacy because of the way the Kremlin can manipulate elections and the media and the political scene. But this vote was set for April 22nd. And then I think, everyone, correspondent in Moscow, one of our correspondents, Matthew Luxmore, wrote, a good story about how the Victory Day parade, and this was before that was postponed, would kind of seal Putin's role as kind of presiding and set him forth on this journey in which he could stay as president in power through 2036. Now that all has been postponed. The vote has been postponed, and the military parade. Both are supposed to be held later this year. No dates have been set definitely. Um, so that and in the meantime, I mean, what happened obviously to make Putin postpone both of those events, the vote and the military parade, uh, was the coronavirus, which um, came into Russia, as you said. I think in early March there were no cases, and it seems to me it's hard to judge, but it seems to me that Putin and the Kremlin may have thought that that Russia could avoid really bearing the brunt or being hit hard by COVID-19. They closed the border with China fairly early, closed some other borders, but I think, in my mind at least, the way I saw it, they were the lockdown measures were not imposed until after some other countries had done that, um, and so to me it seems like Putin thought they could avoid a huge kind of effect, but that obviously hasn't been the case. We have cases. The official numbers of infections have been over 10,000 for many days now, I think, and there are many signs, including open statements by the Moscow mayor, that the real number of cases may be much higher. 187, I think 188,000 is the official number nationwide. Sobyanin suggested that the number in Moscow alone could actually be up to 300,000. So, and then there's also questions for various reasons about the death toll in Russia, which uh, the the ratio of deaths to cases to infections is very low, and there are various reasons that this may the real numbers may be higher. So I think what this has really done, and meanwhile there's the economic impact, which is obviously being felt very seriously, and I think people are wondering what's going to happen after the lockdown does end. Is the economy going to improve? Is it, are they going to be still without jobs? The GDP is now predicted to decline by at least 5% this year. Could be more. Unemployment going up. Um, and meanwhile, the healthcare system is struggling, obviously, to deal with this. One of the sort of most tragic cases has been three doctors who have fallen or plunged from windows in the past two or 3 weeks. Two of them have died of their injuries, and these are all doctors who were under pressure for various reasons due to the coronavirus, and so this is kind of particularly tragic, I guess, occurrences that have shown how much strain the healthcare system and the frontline medical workers are under. And so now you have Putin going. Tomorrow is the Victory Day, May 9th, and I guess Putin was hoping probably uh, to again, preside over this big parade. 75 years since the Nazi Germany's defeat, which is still and very understandably so the proudest moment for many Russians, I think, in Russia and Soviet history. The cost, the sacrifice was unparalleled. 27 million people killed, I believe, in the war. So, Putin was going into this seeing it as a big day, and now I think what he's facing is a situation where he has a real problem on his hands. His government has a real problem on its hands. It's persistent. It can't really be dealt with by image making, and the consequences are still unknown. So it's yeah, I do think I think you mentioned maybe the biggest challenge that Putin has faced, that the government has faced over his 20 years in power. So I guess I've been going on too long, but I'll turn it back to you. Back over to you, Jonathan. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for sort of really sort of honing on a couple of these issues too. And one thing that struck me is that is this idea that the Russian public is lost faith, that it's changed. Something has actually changed between the public and Putin, because his popularity numbers, even if we dispute the methodology or maybe even the accuracy of polling, suggests that he's been quite popular. And despite many different challenges. And also, he was the one who sort of post 90s is the image of Russia coming out of economic decline and rebuilding. And this is something that harkens back these challenges, both economically and in terms of the inability of government of him to actually deal with this issue, harkens back to closer to those days than it does to what he has put in place over the last 2 decades. So, Irina, I'm going to turn to you because I want to ask you: are you seeing that same change in the public perception and engagement? Do you view this as many do, as this being Putin's worst crisis? Also, I know that you've, just in looking at regions and the role of regional players and actors, it seems quite different in a highly centralized Kremlin, Moscow, and a lot of pressure now being placed at local levels to deal, with this challenge, given that the Kremlin may not have the capacity to do so. I mean, what's changed? What do you see in terms of those dynamics? And it strikes me that I wonder, Steve, and when you brought up this past story of Gorbachev too, whether you're not going to see some other power players within. And Kiryl, I'll ask you this too: is that chess is such an important part of the psyche of what's taking place internally within Kremlin. Are we seeing, for example, the mayor of Moscow? Are we seeing new power dynamics forming? And of course, I know that it's hard to see the end of the tunnel in this, because the crisis hasn't peaked, and there's likely to be second, maybe even third waves of the coronavirus. And so governments are going to need to be acting over in a concerted period, not just even in the short term. So, Irina, over to you. I didn't mean to hog it, but Steve, you brought up so many important points that I think I want Irina and Kiryl to speak to. But Irina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for inviting me to this conversation today. I think it's really a very important topic, and especially since really tomorrow is the 9th of May, the day that Putin was projecting as a day of glory for him and for the mighty Russia that he created, and it all kind of faded away with coronavirus pandemic. But yeah, you told about you said about the numbers and how people react. Really, we call ourselves to some extent a crisis radio, even though we are not a radio. We were blocked as a radio. We were taken away the license from us by the Russian government. It blocked the broadcast in Russia, so we are mostly internet platform right now. Uh, but we are crisis media because when there is a crisis in Russia, people turn to us because they want reliable information, and they know that maybe in normal times they can watch Russian television and read other websites, but when it's crisis, they turn to us. They come, then they probably leave again. But right now we have a peak of audience because of the coronavirus and because people really want to have reliable information on what's going on. Regarding what happened in Russia recently, and I would look at it from the perspective of a media person, of course, and from the perspective of how the Russian government manipulated with the whole outbreak of the coronavirus in the other countries at the beginning, even starting from with China in January, in February. Russia used its position of being like a neighbor and to some extent an ally of China, a trade partner definitely, to show to the domestic audience that Russia is above. Russia is really strong. That Russian medicine is strong enough, and it was taken by China to fight the COVID-19. That Russia has enough ventilators. Then, when the outbreak started in Europe, it was the same. Russia was using its propaganda to show that the country, that Russia will not face the same crisis as as weak European countries, as they say. So this, planes that came to Italy with Russian military planes, with help, with ventilators, this advertisement videos of Russian military in protective gear, sanitizing Italian senior homes. Then there were 11 planes that came to Belgrade when also military planes, when the outbreak in Serbia was not that big at that time at all. So Russia was, Kremlin was projecting to the Russian people that Russia is above these epidemics and pandemics. Russia is well prepared, and it's not going to be the case in Russia that there will be no chaos. Even when the epidemic started in Russia, the uh, the bureaucrats from the health ministry, for example, the officials were claiming that Russia has medicine. Russia has medicine ready to fight COVID, effective, and that they will use it, and that nothing to worry about. So, and to some extent, they are now hostages of this propaganda that they were using to, raise the profile of Russia in the world and in the eyes of ordinary decent Russians. So now, when the outbreak started in Russia itself, um, they uh, they don't even know which words to use to describe it. And it's very striking for me because for the first month, they were saying that, well, the number was, let's say, 2,000 new cases per day, and that many, let's say, 50 deaths. But the deaths were mostly because the people were sick already, mostly from different cases and not from COVID, and the deaths were kind of COVID only aggravated the situation with their health, but mostly, they were diabetics, for example. So it's not COVID, it's other diseases. Right now, they cannot say it because the number of deaths are growing. Once again, slightly strangely different from the tendencies in the rest of the world, because if you look at Russian statistics, and Steve was correct, it's 0.9% mortality rate in Russia right now. But they still continue to say the same words, that it's not from coronavirus, because they don't know other words. And this whole situation uh, was formed by the fact that if probably, yes, it is the first crisis for Mr. Putin, as probably the first crisis for each and every government in Europe, even though those governments were not in power for 20 years, but still, and But the problem is that this crisis came after 20 years in power. If it came uh, earlier, then Putin probably was a little bit more active, a little bit more willing to be active. And right now, the situation in Russia for me is like Kremlin believes its own press releases that Russia was ready for this epidemic, that Russia was uh, capable of curing COVID-19, that Russia had medicine, that Russia had enough ventilators, and they really believed in all this. I think just last quick point. I think that the fact that Putin decided to give extra powers to the governors was a very smart move because with Russia diversity, to be able to control everything from Moscow right now is impossible. Plus, Moscow is the center of epidemics. 60% of all the cases in Russia are concentrated in Moscow right now. With this diverse conditions of the spread of coronavirus around the country, that was a very smart move to give extra powers to local authorities to deal with the crisis according to the situation in their areas. But the problem, once again, is 20 years in power, and 20 years the country was ruled from one place, from Moscow, by one hand, and it doesn't know anymore how to operate with different hands, and not from the center, but on the very spot where the situation develops. Uh, Speaking about the local authorities, for example, there is a kind of a dissent in Russia right now. Not everywhere, but where the governors are or heads of the republics are strong, they they take control of the situation by themselves. And I'll just give you one example of this dissent is North Ossetia, uh, because Putin also decided not only to postpone the military parade and the celebrations of the 9th of May, but also to change the date of the end of the World War from the 2nd of September to the 3rd of September. Unfortunately, the 3rd of September is a very sad day for Russia. In 2004, on that day, over 300 people were killed in North Ossetia, in Beslan, during the terrorist attack on the school in this town. And this is a day of memory and grief for North Ossetian people. So the head of North Ossetia said that not only he is not pleased with the decision to move the date of the celebrations of the second victory in the Second World War to the 3rd of September. But the words that he used, he will not allow any celebrations in North Ossetia on this day. So with this, I will stop. And Jonathan, back to you.
Thank you, and thank you for that assessment. And it's interesting to hear how this has become sort of a decentralized effort within Russia to address the challenge. I also just sort of spin on yours too, which is the masters of people perceive the Kremlin to be masters of propaganda, but in essence, this is something that you can't spin. You can't really spin the numbers. They tried to, and it didn't work. Or Russia's position vis-a-vis, look how strong we are compared to others. That doesn't work. And it's very interesting because this is clearly also, it's a horrible situation, but it's also to highlight that propaganda doesn't work. Good governance works. Reactions to this work, I hope, for the most part, if people are working together. Kiryl, I just wanted to bring you into this conversation too. Just listening to what Steve and Irina had to say, your thoughts about how things are different today than they were previously, and whether the political dynamics internally are really changing. And hard to know completely, but just based on sort of your long view of sort of politics internally in these regions too. Obviously, governors that maybe didn't have to play a role are now having to play that role. Maybe some are more successful than others, but most were put in place connected directly politically to Mr. Putin, to the Kremlin as well. It's not as if you have an Andrew Cuomo, maybe you do, or a DeWine or others that we see in the United States, where Republicans and Democratic governors are stepping up and filling spaces. I know it's not apples to apples in Russia, but maybe you could just pick up on your perspective and then sort of commenting on what you hear coming from both Steve and Irina.
Good morning, everyone, and it's an honor to be a part of this. It's really interesting how we are trying to kind of discuss now and see what is going on in Russia, trying to comprehend what's going on in Russia at the moment. And I think somewhere in his villa, hunkered in his bunker, Vladimir Putin is doing the same thing. He's trying to understand what is going on and what went wrong. And how to regain control. It's very interesting to see, like 4 months ago, it was a completely different world for Russia. Putin had 2 major campaigns planned for 2020. 2020 was a major and important year for him. So on January 15, right off the bat, he comes in front of parliament and says, I want to amend the constitution to pretty much rule forever, to be a president for life. And we will hold a referendum sometime early spring. And after that, he was supposed to go on May 9th, massive celebration. That's tomorrow. That's the day tomorrow, which is a religious holiday in Russia of religious importance. So President Vladimir Putin was due to speak on May 9th on Red Square. To Russians, it's as important as, I don't know, and as revered as Pope Francis does his Urbi et Orbi at Easter. And at that time in January, 4 months ago, it was rumored that President Trump would be coming. It was rumored that President Zelensky of Ukraine would be coming. Other world leaders will be coming to Russia, to Vladimir Putin, to the center of the universe on that day. That was his plan. And then suddenly something went wrong within a matter of weeks. And now he's in his bunker, last seen in public 6 weeks ago. Referendum is not happening. Nobody knows when it will happen or if it will happen. Whether those amendments will be passed, we don't know. What happens to the Kremlin towers and to all his entourage who's now detached from him, we don't know. We also, and May 9th, tomorrow, that ever important day for him, is not happening either. So he's not delivering the speech. Trump is not coming. Zelensky is not coming. Nobody is coming. There is no parade. There will be just aviation flyby. So this is really, this is the biggest crisis in his 20 years, because for the first time, he faces objective reality and he has to fight objective reality, not something that they spin. And it does bring consequences. Just 2 days ago, on May 6th, Levada Center, which is probably the most respected polling organization in Russia, released its new ratings. And Putin's approval rating is lowest ever in his 20 years of power. So his approval rating is now 59%, and 33% of polled told pollsters they disapprove of Putin's performance, which is really important. And so he's now trying to understand what is going on, but he can't because he doesn't know. So he does his weekly addresses to the nation, something he was not doing before. But he's losing that narrative too. So his first was on March 25th, his second was on April 2nd. It was broadcast on all channels of Russian television. We on Current Time, for those who don't know, Current Time is 24/7 Russian language TV and digital network aimed at audiences in the former Soviet Union. And we are growing audiences exponentially because people turn to us to understand what is really happening. So we broadcast those addresses to the nation, but we brought it into context, bringing opposition leaders, doctors, business people, commentators, different regions. And it was our broadcast that was trending on YouTube as #2 in Russia, and in both instances. So people were watching us to see Putin rather than somebody else on YouTube. And that was staggering. That means that they're losing this narrative, and they don't know how to proceed later. In all our evening shows, where we're talking what is really happening. Doctors without PPEs, a head doctor in St. Petersburg where every single medical worker is sick with coronavirus, another doctor in Dagestan in southern Russia who says that he says, I have a fever and nobody tested me for coronavirus and nobody testing anyone for coronavirus and we're all sick. And so on and so forth. Just in a couple of hours in our tonight's broadcast, there will be another story how doctors are not paid at all. As Steve mentioned, there was a number of suicides by doctors. So this is kind of a facing objective reality doesn't work for Putin. And we don't know how much does he control now because all we see him is in this bunker. I will leave you with a very telling detail. In the first of his address to the nation on March 25th, he was sitting in front of that screen with some kind of what you see now, this zoom of the whole government. And he was sitting there trying to control everything. And in a wide shot, you know, I'm a TV guy, so I just noticed those things. On a wide shot, his chair, you know, his working chair on wheels was taped to the floor by the tape, and everything else was just taped to the floor. So they're trying to secure a chair under him because people were not sure that he would be able to control that chair and maybe wheel away and will kind of, I don't know what. So if he can't control the chair, what can he control? On all subsequent broadcasts, we never saw that wide angle before, so we don't see that. But he has now his government on Zoom. His prime minister is down with coronavirus. His construction minister is down with coronavirus. His culture minister is down with coronavirus. And the head designer of his space program has died of coronavirus. The numbers are growing, and people stopped or are stopping listening to him or believe in him, and nobody knows who rules the show now. Are those the governors? Are those the mayor of Moscow? And what space is there for President Putin now? So with that, back to you, Jonathan.
Thank you. It's really obviously an incredibly bleak picture, and I think those stories are really disconcerting when we see this anywhere, including in Russia, especially those frontline workers who are not being protected, that are going to be needed for quite some time to deal with this crisis. I wanted to ask about, we've had a number of questions that I would ask those that have joined us. Please send in your questions. We've already received a number of questions, including some questions before we started. But one of them I wanted to ask is that in the past, and I think maybe this would go to all three of you to address. And it was mentioned in one of the questions posed by those that are joining virtually, is the issue of how you expect Putin to respond. In the past, he's typically stirred up nationalist sentiment. At times it's been foreign excursions or Russian actions, whether we talk about Crimea or we're talking about Syria, this projection externally to build up sort of this national image. And it seems, I'm not sure if this is the case where that type of activity would work, but for those that are listening or wondering, well, what do you expect? How do you expect Putin to respond to this? Should we be expecting that he will look to lash out in his region or via foreign policy? Is it more of an expectation that you'd actually could see a deepening crackdown internally? Nobody here touched on specifically on independent media, what's happening. And I think what I did hear was that, Kiryl, is that you're saying that, that your numbers in terms of those that are either watching or listening are increasing significantly, which suggests to me that there's quite likely a crackdown, or at least a less trust in the media internally, a lot of which is controlled by Kremlin-related interests. So maybe if I could speak to one, which is, what do we expect from somebody like Putin, who's a tactician, KGB tactician? Not, again, I go back to not a maybe the right manager you want for a crisis internally like this. And maybe Kiryl, I'll start with you and then go to Steve, Irina to respond. And if any of our panelists have two fingers that they want to raise because they want to respond to something, please do so as well. Kiryl, over to you to answer that question from our audience.
So I think the natural reaction of Putin, because Putin doesn't like to be under pressure, and he tries to divert that pressure somewhere. So I think his tactics now is kind of wait and see until it all dies out. It's like a cat, that hides behind the curtain and thinks that if I don't see anyone, that nobody sees me. So that's pretty much the cat tactics of Vladimir Putin now, but it doesn't work. And as many people now project, and we're waiting to see whether, he's trying to, everybody was expecting from him to offer some help to businesses, to ordinary people, something. And he doesn't do, in his, again, recent broadcast, everybody was thinking, will he offer us something? And the only thing he did was to announce another public holiday, the day of medical worker. And that's all the help that you can get in Russia. So, he doesn't have a strategy, I believe, to deal with that. And governors take the initiative. And I think that this is obviously a rich basis for any public unrest that may ensue in the regions, because people will be without money and nobody gives that money to them. People will see the real situation, that people are sick and dying, and that's something that the Kremlin should be concerned about foremost.
Yeah, I would just add, I guess, to what you're saying. I think to some degree, Putin, although his statements about the coronavirus crisis have, he's registered that it's a problem, but I think he's still to some degree living in denial. I think Sergei Guriev, who's an economist, said this is a little while ago, but said, he's treating it as if it's normal, which is frightening. And that plays into what you're saying about, people are expecting something and they're not getting it, they're not hearing it. So I think I agree. I think it's a wait and see attitude still. And that also goes to what you were saying about, he doesn't know what's happening, or he's trying to figure out what's happening, what to do about it. In terms of the foreign actions or actions abroad, I don't think I don't think Russia is in a position now to do anything big abroad. I mean, they already sort of weren't, signs of trying to wind down things in Syria, having trouble with Assad, kind of blocking that. In Ukraine, they're going to not going on the offensive, but not making peace either. So I think on the foreign side, I don't think you're going to see anything soon that's very big. Domestically, Jonathan, you mentioned the media, and I do think he's the media, and also just in terms of, and I think the Russian government, the law enforcement authorities will, when this is over, when the lockdowns are over, they're going to sort of, continue to kind of crack down and try not to let anyone, try to further clamp down on any protests. And I don't see them as likely to go the other way. And already, there's a fake news law, and now the new one that's punishing for what the state considers fake news about coronavirus. So those are the kind of things, and I think human rights groups are saying, these kind of additional kind of tightening of the screw are probably not going to go away when and if this crisis eases.
Irina?
Yeah, speaking about the new law that punishes for the so-called fake news, we are actually the victim of this, because our journalist in St. Petersburg took an interview with the doctor who was complaining that there was not enough ventilators in St. Petersburg, and that there is not enough qualified staff in the hospitals right now to deal with the coronavirus. And this is something that each and every doctor in the world faced probably recently. Well, she was actually questioned by the police and asked to reveal her source. So we refused to do it, of course. We will not give the source. But there is already pressure on media, of course, not to publish any, not even unreliable information, but not to publish questions about how the government is dealing with the COVID epidemics.
Do you see, or do you see the government actually providing any transparent information via, are they providing transparent information via Kremlin-controlled news sources now? What does the information or disinformation look like right now from your perspective?
Well, the disinformation looks is in terms of numbers, of course, official numbers, because they explain that the way Russia counting the deaths is different from the way Europe, for example, was counting or is counting the deaths, because Russia does officially, that was said officially, Russia does not include those who are COVID positive but died from another reasons rather than the pneumonia, and whose lungs are clear, for example, are not enlisted in the list of dead from COVID epidemics. But even if you look at the numbers in several Russian regions, then you will see that the numbers of people officially dead from COVID and the people who were COVID positive but died of another reasons than pneumonia, they are 3 times higher. So not all the regions are making these statistics, but at least 3 regions in Russia are making. And of course, there are a lot of questions, but this is at least some glimpse of look in reality what's going on. But otherwise, I think that the statistics of those infected with COVID, I think the government is actually, in this case, is giving the numbers that they really know, because they don't know a lot still. And as any other government around us right now, they really don't know. Nobody knows the real number of infected people. The only thing that you can be sure in is the number of tests that have been done. So I think in this case, the statistics is correct. What they are trying to avoid is information about how the hospitals are prepared for this epidemic, how the doctors are actually really working in the hospitals, whether there is an order, a good flow of medical care, or there is a mess. And in a lot of hospitals, there is a mess because people with real pneumonia are put in the same rooms with the people with COVID. So people with pneumonia but COVID negative are together with a COVID positive. So, and there are a lot of cases. And for example, one of the ladies complained in St. Petersburg, complained that she was put in the same room with 2 other COVID positive patients, even though her test is negative. So she complained to the governor to the mayor of St. Petersburg. In his Vkontakte, it's like a Russian social media, social network, looks a little bit like Facebook. So she complained through Vkontakte directly to the mayor of St. Petersburg. His reaction was he blocked her. He just banned her. So this is what's the most, I think, what's the most sensitive for the Russian government right now.
Yeah, and I'm glad you raised this issue of the journalists and journalists that you work with and the challenges they're facing to connect to those people that seem to have difficulty explaining what's happened and what's needed in a transparent way. And I think that's important. I have sort of one foreign policy question that I received, sort of pushing back a little bit on sort of Russia not acting externally. This is a question related to what's taking place, what took place in Prague. That what was the if Russia is so consumed internally, why do you have, as it's reported, that these potential assassinations would be ordered right now? Is the Kremlin trying to show that no, we're still in control? And is it symbolic because what took place in Prague was, taking down of statues or a diminishing Soviet past? It seemed to fit in very closely with this desire to, to ensure that these particular issues remain public in Russia. I don't know how this story plays out. Maybe it's not even reported on. So there's the external. Also, the external of these phone calls between Trump and Putin that have taken place. I've seen RFE reporters focusing on this. What Russia wants from external actors, and somebody like Donald Trump, is it asking for help? Is it asking for sanctions to be removed? Is it asking for who is Putin looking towards as a partner now to help with the internal challenges? Is it the West? Is it China? And then also just looking more domestically, are we seeing cracks in the elite right now? Is that what you're seeing? In terms of those that are around Putin, and it would seem to me that we haven't really gone too deeply into the economic situation. A number of sectors that have been particularly hard hit during the sanctions period. Putin did a lot to really to strengthen the domestic capacity of Russia's internal economy to withstand some of the impacts of sanction. Obviously, has had large reserves as well, and to be able to withstand these types of challenges. So I wanted to maybe just touch on both. Maybe Steve, talk to you, because you brought up that you don't think that Russia is capable right now, but yet you see suitcases full of rice, and as has been reported, in the Czech Republic. It's not far from where you guys are sort of working in these spaces. So I wanted to ask you about that, but then maybe just turn back to sort of the cracks internally that you're seeing as well, that I think are of interest for people trying to figure out, what's the internal impact of those people that are around Putin and what you might see. So maybe Steve, we could start with you.
Sure, I'll try to discuss those three things quickly. I think the reported attack, or the suitcase full of rice and reportedly brought into Prague, and reportedly with the target being the mayor and a couple of district chiefs. I mean, I think it's sort of not really connected with the coronavirus per se. It's more connected. I mean, if it was either, something that actually happened deliberately, or if it was something that the Kremlin maybe wanted to, people to hear about happening. In either of those cases, I think it's linked more to Victory Day and there have been these disputes in advance of Victory Day with various countries, Poland mostly, also the Czech Republic, about the history of World War II and the ensuing years of Soviet domination. So the Rysen story really plays into the dispute that is really heated up between Prague and Moscow over that. Essentially, the two things being, the two elements being the removal of a statue, a monument to a Soviet World War II marshal in Prague, who liberated part of Czechoslovakia and Eastern Europe, but is seen here widely as a symbol of the post-war dominance of the Soviet Union in the communist era. And then also the renaming of the square right outside the Russian embassy compound here in Prague after Boris Nemtsov, who was the the Putin critic and former deputy prime minister who was shot to death in 2015 near the Kremlin. So I think those, that story, presumably without the coronavirus, the same thing may or could have happened. So I think that's kind of a somewhat separate thing, and it is something that I guess if Russia did it, then it's kind of a not small, but it's an isolated incident that when I say I don't think they're going to be doing anything big abroad, I mean they're obviously still fighting in Syria, fighting in Ukraine. But I just mean I don't think they're going to be making any sort of big campaign outside the borders until things kind of settle down. So that's what I'd say about that. As for the conversations between Trump and Putin, I think in Putin's mind, I think he's mainly trying to use the coronavirus crisis. And Kiryl mentioned efforts to, and Irina mentioned efforts to kind of at the beginning play out, say that Russia was actually going to be helping and not being hurt, helping everybody else. I think the conversations to some degree are about things that are happening, coronavirus, arms control, but they're also an effort by Putin and the Kremlin to kind of use this to again, what they always want to do is to put Russia on par with the U.S. These are the former superpowers. These are the two countries that need to solve the world's problems. So I think that's one of the things there. And of course, sending humanitarian aid from the Russian point of view, I think that is whether to Italy or to the U.S. is clearly is kind of a propaganda infused move that they want to make. So that's what I would say about those two matters.
Yeah, and I just want to sort of, if you recall, the last time that Russia was involved in a foreign assassination attempt, there was a huge diplomatic response, but from a number of NATO and European countries, including the Czech Republic, to that. And I get a sense, though, from here in Washington, people are watching this very, very closely as well, because of the pattern of activity. And maybe I can ask you too. I mean, what you mentioned too is it's interesting. Russia obviously very early was trying to use sort of assistance, sort of outward. I think we have to associate sort of countries buying equipment versus those that are given in sort of given out of the goodness of the heart. And I'm just wondering if you see Russia accepting any assistance now, whether it's from international organizations or China. Or is there a receptivity to receiving help, or is it just the mentality is no, we don't need any help, because it obviously, given the circumstance, it would seem that help is actually needed.
Yeah, I think it's more. I mean, if you took interesting to look at the White House and Kremlin statements about Trump and Putin's most recent phone call, which the White House said that. Trump told Putin that the United States is ready to help all countries, including Russia, in terms of with help with equipment and stuff for the coronavirus. The Kremlin statement said that Trump had proposed that the U.S. send medical equipment to Russia, but it did not then say and we accepted it. So, and Putin accepted it. So I think the kind of PR effort there by the Kremlin is to say, look, we are being offered aid. We have good relations with the U.S., but we might not really need it. So I think that's what's going on there, and so far I haven't seen much about any large amounts or significant amounts of aid being sent to Russia, and I don't think, I think if they do take it, they would not want, or the Kremlin would not want to make that very very well known.
Irina, Kiryl, can I just bring you into on? I mentioned, and if please feel free to weigh in on the foreign policy side of this too. Interesting that they actually even mentioned the fact that the U.S. offered that type of assistance right now, because it's controversial here in the United States in terms of offering this type of equipment, even at a time when it's still needed in various places across the U.S. And that it's mentioned in this conversation. But I also wonder too, just as we were talking about before, sort of the internal dynamics, and we had questions, that have come through asking about cracks in the Russian elite, questions about whether or not, and see if you can answer these two after. So we go round robin about the Russian opposition, whether it has actually, what is the status or state of Russian opposition in this conversation. And so I was hoping you might be able to pick up on those two, maybe on those two issues. And if you feel free, if you want to jump in terms of what Steve has said. Also, we've gone a little bit over time, and I appreciate that. Before that, I understand that you have a little bit more time to give, but I am aware of the clock. And so, Irina, can I turn it over to you first, and then Kiryl to talk a little bit more, pull apart sort of this domestic configuration, a little bit more domestically, the political configuration of elites and then opposition.
Well, thank you. I frankly don't see any cracks in the political elite right now, primarily because Putin actually formed a government that is a technical government. The prime minister, who was today, actually, he was hosting the government meeting from the hospital where he is with COVID. He is a technical prime minister. He knows how to collect taxes, but he is not a politician. And Putin, for quite a time now, surrounded himself with people who are not politicians, who are just either his friends or people who more or less know their area of expertise. So in these circumstances, to expect any sort of cracks within the ruling elite is pretty difficult. Regarding the opposition, frankly, I also don't see it at all. I don't see the opposition right now, even though I understand that over 20 years and with the repressions and with the murders of opposition leaders, the opposition was marginalized, and it's small and it's fragile. But now it's very easy right now to say that if Kremlin says that, or if Sobyanin says, Moscow mayor says that you should wear masks, then the opposition would say, no, this is stupidity, you should not wear masks. Right, but this is not the level of opposition that can have significant impact on the popularity of opposition in the long run. So it's kind of pretty empty right now in terms of opposition and in terms of any policy in Russia at the moment. But regarding the international stuff and what Russia will do you know that there is a search engine in Russia which is called Yandex, which is a Russian version of Google. So do you know what's trending today in Yandex? Starting from this morning, the news about the new Su fighter jets, Su-57, and the fact that they will get the new engines. I mean, among coronavirus, among all the things that are going on in Russia, among the economic grief, this is what trending in the news. This is what state media is reporting about. So the focus is again on the military might, on the Russian military or military production successes, and this is the only thing that they can show to the to the domestic public right now. Jonathan, to you.
Kiryl, just sort of picking up on that too, on Irina's commentary too about both elites, opposition, and I did want to ask you too about when do you expect a vote to be set on the constitutional amendments, which a couple of the questions coming in also wanted to get, you know, maybe from all three of you, but maybe Kiryl, maybe you want to answer that based on sort of how much time we have, when you expect those amendments to be set for a vote.
Yeah, I'll come to the amendments in a second. Very clear, I think we can say that jostling behind Putin's back has started. Kremlin has never been united. Kremlin has several towers. And, you know, in towers, I mean, you know, the not as much the buildings, but the centers of influence. And Putin has not been a czar. He's been a chairman of the board, a very influential and very strong chairman of the board, but trying to balance those different interests. And now that chairman of the board is missing in action, he does not take any decisions. And in that vacuum, the jostling clearly has started. You know, Moscow mayors fancies himself, Sobyanin as, you know, and his political future. There are a couple of other people who are making subtler and probably smarter moves. But that thing, you know, life after Putin, even despite his desire to run for life, the life after Putin is suddenly on the cards, and people are just starting to see how that may look like and who will play the role. The opposition is likely not to play a role. You know, we will probably see people from the same palace ruling Russia after Putin if he were to disappear from the picture. And people are starting to maneuver what to do. And I think that's very interesting. And it's very interesting will be to see what will happen if the public unrest starts and if one of those figures decides to ride that wave and to support that. The public unrest, we've seen mass protests last year in Russia. They arrived unexpectedly. They were much larger than anybody thought about. They were driven by the opposition, but not only. So if anybody from within the circle of power decides to take that sentiment on board and somehow to prop that will be very interesting, because that will be a very powerful weapon in the fight for power. The opposition, the mass protests were the only thing that they could do. And now they don't have them because, frankly, you can't see any people coming in thousands into mass rallies anymore. They try to outmaneuver Putin, offering some wise populist moves and programs, economic programs, but it's hard to see how they will get traction of that. So I would rather, you know, the opposition is trying to do Zoom protest rallies, but that probably is something that Kremlin really likes to see, because they would prefer people to protest on Zoom rather than the street. So, you know, I would watch any moves from behind Putin's back with regard to protest sentiment.
And
the votes. That's really interesting, because it was supposed to be. I think they're now regretting that they did not speed up. So April 22nd came and gone. So now they were talking end of May, early June. Then they were talking June. Then they were talking September. Now I've seen people mentioning December 12th, which is the Constitution Day. I've seen some musings from in a couple of days that maybe it can be cancelled. Maybe the Constitutional Court will rule that this referendum is not needed at all. So it will be very interesting to see. But with coronavirus, people forgot about those amendments. They were like 2 lives ago.
Thank you. We're up to our, I think, our time, since we've gone over a little bit, and I think you've answered many of the questions. I just want to maybe just turn to each of you for just a final thought. This is going to be, obviously, the coronavirus challenge is one that's going to be long term, both economic, political. Russia in this case, and what's taking place in Russia is, there's a tragedy, but also really just one of the most stark shifts in terms of where we were a few months ago to where we are today. And I really want to sort of admire, again, the work that you guys are doing and appreciate some of the insights that you're providing, and hope that we can do this again to be able to provide those that are in Russia, outside, in the US, in Europe, these types of insights. But maybe if I could just maybe go down the line and sort of ask each one of you. Steve, I'm going to ask you to be the cleanup hitter on this one. But Irina, if I could start with you, if any final thoughts. And again, thank you for the work that you're doing. I think it's so incredibly valuable, and I also appreciate those that are working with you on the ground as well. And this goes for all of you that are providing you with the up-to-date, on-the-ground information and are facing direct challenges and threats. So Irina, any final thoughts?
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for those words. When I'm looking at Russia right now, I really hope that Russians would learn one lesson from this epidemic. It's striking for me to see how Russia was really disattached from the rest of the world, how Russia was living within Russia, together with the economic sanctions, but mostly with the self-imposed sanctions that Kremlin imposed after the annexation of Crimea. It's like they are opening the coronavirus for themselves right now. They don't know the experience of Europe or the United States. They don't know, the doctors don't know about the international research made in this area. And they are studying coronavirus, from the blank list practically. So I really hope that that would be a lesson, not only for Russians, but also for Kremlin. Because if Kremlin would not have wasted practically 2 months in taking serious measures of isolation, self-isolation, of protective measures for people, if Kremlin managed to convince the media to explain in normal language what kind of threat this disease is posing, Russia would have been in much better shape right now. It's a month away from us in Europe. It had an extra month to deal with the preparation, to deal with the explanation to the population of what should be done and how should be done, and what's the effective experience that other countries had and what didn't work. None of this has been done just because of the self-isolation that Kremlin put the country in.
Kiryl, thank you.
I would say that politically, coronavirus has become the black swan for the Russian politics, and it's injected so much uncertainty that it's head spinning. This is the biggest crisis that Russia probably had during 20 years of Putin's power. Yesterday, May 7th, was exactly 20 years to the day when he was inaugurated for the first term. Now nobody knows how much is left for him politically. If a year ago somebody would ask me, do you think that Putin will be president of Russia in a year from now? I would say yeah. But now the ground shifted so much within a matter of weeks that if somebody were to ask me, do I think whether Putin will still be president of Russia a year from now? I say, look, I don't know. We'll see. So, and that's how big it is. And the history of Russia shows us that the crisis when it comes much later than people expect. but when it does arrive, it happens much faster than people expect.
Thank you. Steve?
Yeah, I think there's a Russian saying about that. I can't remember what it is, but I would just like to go back to address what Kiryl was saying and to follow up on that in terms of the uncertainty on the idea that a post-Putin era is once again sort of coming into view. I think into people's view, into the view of the elites and the everyone else. So I think, you know, obviously the effort to enable him to potentially be president until 2036 push that back again. You know, even if he was going to, you know, not take that option, it's still, he was holding it in reserve, you know, and that sets completely different kind of guidelines and for the elites and for other people to think about. And now that that's at least been postponed, and he's dealing with this, you know, questions about his response to the coronavirus, that just kind of, it's like a double, you know, it really, I think, you know, people are writing and saying that, well, he's not going to make it to 2036. I think people are saying that, and it sort of brings that the question of a post-Putin Russia back to the fore. And as Kiryl said, elites are probably jockeying for position, you know, somewhat behind the scenes, and you're seeing some of them more publicly than others. But one thing that Kiryl also mentioned, I think, would maybe kind of a good sign of what you know, what Putin's thinking and how, I guess, fearful he might be about the future is whether they do go ahead and say, oh, the Constitutional Court go ahead and say, well, we don't need the popular vote, the nationwide vote on these constitutional changes. I think by law, the fact is they don't, but it was, you know, this was done because Putin likes to have, even though critics say, and I think rightly so, that he uses the people very often for his own purposes, but he does like to have at least the feeling, or the, you know, on the surface, their support for whatever he does. He actually put it that way, and the Constitutional Court put it that way in some of the statements they made about these constitutional changes that would allow him to be president further. So I think if he goes ahead, or if they go ahead and say, okay, actually we don't need the vote, I think that's going to be sort of a sign that look, you know, I think that there'll be a sign that there's fear in the Kremlin of, you know, what that could bring, and you know, I don't think people would take that very well.
Well, thank you, Steve, for that. And Kiryl, I think everybody will be, and Irina, everybody will be looking to what you're writing and reporting on in this space, and also sort of watching sort of for these telltale signs politically, internally, the external challenges as well that Russia has been engaged in. And we didn't get a chance to touch on some of the other relationships like China, but it's complex. And Irina, I think you brought out the tragedy of the moment for average Russian citizens who are, you know, expecting government to be able to step in to provide them with the right type of assistance right now, which is clearly a challenge. And obviously, Kiryl, you mentioning a black swan. I think there's a lot of governments that are looking now to it this as a black swan, but I think nobody more so that I've seen as somebody who's followed Russia from various positions in and outside of government. This is clearly that, and we'll be looking to all of you and reading what you're writing about, and looking forward to your next opportunity to speak with you, to answer questions, and to be with us. And so on behalf of the German Marshall Fund, RFERL, thank you so much. I wish we could all be in a room together to applaud both the work you're doing, but also for what you for your willingness to come to be here today and join us. And I also just want to thank all those that have joined virtually as well. We'll have the audio of this available for anybody who wants to refer back to it and we'll be sharing it on a number of different mediums. And so on behalf, again, of GMF and RFE-RL, thank you so much. Thank you to our speakers who have joined us. Everybody stay safe, stay healthy, and we look forward to seeing you again soon on our next virtual event from GMF. Thank you so much. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you. Love to do it again.
Thank you. Take care.